The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
This episode of the Charlotte Ledger Podcast is sponsored by Crimson Park Digital. For Charlotte businesses, getting noticed and staying visible is tougher than ever. That's where Crimson Park Digital comes in, a boutique marketing agency delivering bespoke strategies for advertising, content, social media, and search engines. They're helping bold, service-focused brands get seen, capture demand, and turn attention into revenue. Ready to bolster your marketing this year? Visit crimsonparkdigital.com to get started. Hey, it's Tony Mecia with the Charlotte Ledger, and you're listening to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. You can find out more about the Charlotte Ledger at thecharlotteledger.com. Today's podcast is a recording of a conversation I had with Tom Hanchett, who's one of Charlotte's best-known local historians. In front of a live audience at the Sharon at South Park retirement community, we talked about some of the roots of why Charlotte is the way it is, how neighborhoods developed, how Charlotte has traditionally made decisions, the influence of business leaders on political decisions, and how many of those developments in the past carry over and have implications in the present. Hanchett talks about some of his books, including Sorting Out the New South City, which looks at how cities get shaped using Charlotte as the prime example, and Affordable Housing in Charlotte, which looks at the roots of today's challenges with affordable housing. I hope you enjoy the conversation. It was recorded on April 21st, 2026.
Tom, thanks so much for coming. I just wanted to start, we'll talk about Charlotte, we'll talk about Charlotte's history, we'll talk about some of the books that you've written, some of the observations that you have about our community and sort of why it is the way it is and what some of the historical foundations are of that. But wanted to start first with you. What is, it's nice to ask people their Charlotte stories. Everybody has their own, how they got here. What's yours? How did you wind up in Charlotte?
Well, I got out of college when Ronald Reagan was president. And when he was campaigning to be president, he said he was going to zero out all federal funding for historic preservation, which I kind of took personally because I'd gone to Cornell and the University of Chicago, and I was ready for a real job, and they were drying up. And so I don't remember, they didn't have the internet back then in the 1980s, but I got on whatever it was and found out that there was a job in I think, North Carolina, a place called Charlotte. And Dan Morrill, some of you know Dan Morrill, with Historic Landmarks Commission, Sarah Spencer in Dilworth, a whole bunch of people were availing themselves of some federal funds that helped with kind of getting ahead of the very old bulldozers. You know, what is the important parts of our city, the neighborhoods that we don't want to mess up? I didn't know anything about Charlotte. They used to talk back then about the CH factor. You heard the CH factor? No one knew Charlotte. They knew that the University of Virginia was here. We were on the coast of South Carolina. The only person who I knew here, I didn't know him personally, was Billy Graham. Wow. And so I've had a lot to learn, and I've been learning ever since.
So how does that perspective of coming here when you did, how do you think that shapes your perception of Charlotte versus somebody who would have grown up there?
A couple of ways. I came from college towns. My dad was a history professor, and Ithaca is one of the great college towns where Cornell is. And so I got here, and it was very different culturally. They had, the week I got here, they opened Discovery Place, and they signed on WFAE radio. And those were great steps forward, and they still are. Nothing wrong with that. But the fact that a big city like this was only getting around to that in the early 1980s was a little bit of a shock. So this has been a place where there's space to do stuff that in a bigger, more established city you probably wouldn't have a chance to. So that's been a great thing. Being a newcomer means that I see things with fresh eyes. And sometimes that means I make boundless mistakes, and sometimes it means that, the big thing was that I came, like I say, in the early 80s, and people nationally were just discovering Victorian architecture. But people had no pride in it because history, you're a historian. Why don't you go to Johnston? Why don't you go to Williamsburg? And when I realized that between the Victorian architecture and bungalows and the Greek revival, colonial revivals, all of that, but Charlotte had a really rich history. That was too new for most people to look at, and so I've been happy as a pig in mud because I had something to look at.
So why is Charlotte the way that it is? And how do we stack up against other cities? You know, the knock on Charlotte is sometimes, well, we don't really have any culture. There's not a lot of, it's not a Nashville where it has the country music. It's not a Houston where it has the oil. It's not a college town like Charlottesville. It's not rich in history like Charleston is, at least outwardly and obviously so. How does Charlotte stack up, and why is that?
It's a good place to live, and that is not something that every city can boast of. And so I think that we become more willing to embrace that. When I came to Charlotte, we really wanted to be Atlanta. And I spent a year in Atlanta. After I was here the first time, I went off and got a PhD at Chapel Hill and then went and taught at Emory for a year. And at 3 o'clock, the rush hour would start, and it would continue until 3 o'clock the next day. This is in the 1980s, or late 80s. And so I think Charlotte is a city that feels at a disadvantage compared to Chapel Hill or to Asheville when it comes to culture, but we beat them considerably with the number of Fortune 500 companies and the number of banks and all of that. And so I think Charlotte has become more confident in itself and willing to say, oh, we got big trees, those are pretty neat. And we got nice old neighborhoods, that's pretty neat. And we're still figuring out who we want to be when we grow up. That's another reality here.
I know you referred to yourself as a newcomer coming here in the 80s. How has Charlotte changed since you've been here?
Much, much, much bigger. I mean, you all knew that. I live on Central Avenue in the Plaza Midwood neighborhood, and I was there because it was cheaper than some other areas, and never figured that it would be a cultural hotspot, which is what it's become. Central Avenue is the most interesting street in Charlotte. As immigration really began to ramp up here in the late 80s, particularly the 90s and 2000s, because Central Avenue wasn't real fancy and well-to-do, there were spaces for new businesses, new restaurants. Plaza Midwood has now big apartment complexes, and the people that live in them don't spend all their time at home with their computer screens. They come out and they buy ice cream. There are 3 different ice cream spots within a couple of blocks of my house in Plaza Midwood. And so growth is disconcerting. I drive down the street every once in a while and go, where am I? But it is also a compliment to us that people want to live here in large numbers. And once they get here, some of them, just continue onward into the next phase of their careers. But a lot of them are getting involved in our city and trying to make it a better place.
And I think you said that when you moved here, you didn't know a whole lot about Charlotte. Obviously, since then, you've learned a whole lot about Charlotte. You've read books about Charlotte. You speak about Charlotte. How does a historian approach living in a city like this in a way that maybe the rest of us don't? I mean, what sort of conversations are you having? What sort of research are you doing? How do you learn about our city in a way that maybe others don't?
I was really influenced coming into this line of work, whatever it is, by a woman named Jane Jacobs. Does Jane Jacobs mean anything to anybody here? She wrote a book called Life and Death of Great American Cities. And she was in a rundown, awful neighborhood in New York called Greenwich Village, which every smart man said Robert Moses, the beginning of that, he was the guy that built most of the expressways in New York. And Jane Jacobs said, "No, wait a minute, this is a nice neighborhood. It's got many different economic levels. It's got industries in some of these old buildings. It's got people like me, he was a writer and artist. And this is a great place to live." And she started looking at how people interacted with each other. She has a marvelous thing called street ballet, which is what happens as people interact throughout the day. The merchant comes to work and reaches out the door and stands looking and waiting for the first customer to come in. And the homeless person comes by and gets a handout, and people go off to school. And this coming and going that makes a city exciting was something that I was looking for when I got here. And I found it on Central Avenue. I found it in other places. It was not a name brand kind of thing. The fact that many of you have not heard of Jane Jacobs should believe in looking at what really is here, not how it isn't Atlanta or it isn't Williamsburg, but what is it? What are people doing here? How are they here? And it's been a wonderful thing to watch that unfold.
Talk a little bit about your work sorting out the new South City. This is a book that you wrote 20, 25 years ago.
I was going to be out of date. I thought it was going to be no use.
You updated it, I believe, 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And so, and the thesis of it, I think what it does is it looks at Charlotte. And a lot of people say, okay, new South City, booming, population growth, leading bank towers, center of industry. But at the same time, there are also sort of legacies of the past that are kind of a shadow over that. I hope I'm doing justice. Can you expand a little bit on your thesis on sorting out the new South City?
The book is about how Charlotte became a big city, but it's also how it became a segregated city, both on the basis of race and ethnicity, but also on the basis of income. And this is a city where it's real easy to live in your bubble. It's real easy to go to work, go to school, go to church, go to the gym, pretty much with people like you. And it wasn't always that way. What I found when I went back before about 1900 was that there were not distinct black and white neighborhoods. There were not distinct rich and poor neighborhoods. Folks were much more mixed than they are now. And that sorting out took place throughout the 20th century. We've kind of got used to it, but the areas that are doing the best in today's economy are the ones where there's the most fixture. If you look at the difference between uptown Charlotte, which is mostly offices, and South End, which is right next door, but is offices and apartments and breweries and coffee shops.
A lot of breweries and coffee.
South End is doing economically much better than the center city. And that understanding that mixture could be a good thing, people could play off against each other. That's Jane Jacobs' insight, but it's also Charlotte insight.
What were some of those neighborhoods like before 1900? I'm guessing, that Charlotte at that time, you had the uptown or downtown. That's a whole separate discussion about what we call our center city. But and then you had a few neighborhoods surrounding that. Everything else was pretty much out in the country. But what were those ring neighborhoods like at that time?
Well, the whole of the city was within what's now the I-277 loop until about 1890. And that's like 150 years in which you've had a city where everybody could walk to everything they needed to go to. And then Edward Dilworth Lanham bought 400 acres out south of town. He had a pants factory out there, and the building is still there, if you know where to look. But he wanted to develop it as a suburb. And people weren't going to walk that far out of town. And horses and buggies are a big hassle if you're trying to commute every day. And so he called up Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison came here and electrified our little tiny street railway. And all of a sudden you could get on a car, spend a nickel, and get out to Dilworth. People started to commute. And so the first suburbs are Dilworth, Elizabeth, Plaza Menwood, Myers Park, a bunch of smaller neighborhoods, Weston Heights, Wilmore, places like that. And those streetcar suburbs were where I lived all the time. I lived in the Elizabeth neighborhood, and I lived right on the Plaza Menwood. And they were neighborhoods that did not have the whole of Charlotte in them. Like the older part of the city, you walked around the block and you would find people of every economic background, every racial possibility. Once you got out to the suburbs were exclusive, which is a term I never thought much about, just means good. Well, it meant literally they excluded. People were not of such an income level who were not white. And rid you of the needs in my house in Plaza Midwood, as they were in almost every other new neighborhood built after 1900. There are deed restrictions that say this property shall be used for members of the white race only, and that minimum house cost in my neighborhood was about today would be $300,000 to $400,000. And so that intentionality behind segregation It didn't just happen. It wasn't just because people wanted it. It was something that was written into deeds. As we try and pull our society back together, knowing that history was a revelation for me.
We'll be right back to the conversation. But first, this episode of the Charlotte Ledger podcast is presented by Crimson Park Digital, boutique marketing for Charlotte's boldest brands.
Can you put Charlotte in context of the South or the country at that time? I'm guessing Charlotte is not that much different than a lot of other southern cities at that time. Is that right?
Or northern cities. This whole thing happened about the same time in much of the United States. There's been some recent work done on Minneapolis. And the streetcar was developed in right around 1890. And so these new suburbs learned from each other, sprang up almost the same time. Minneapolis got its deed restrictions about the same time we did. I think that part of it is that the United States is experiencing a great wave of immigration at that point. It is also becoming enmeshed in a global economy where 1893, the worst depression we've ever had, except for the 32 depression, was 1893. And so a lot of people are getting buffeted. And they're looking for somebody to blame. There's a lot of anti-immigrant stuff going on. Here in the South, we had almost no immigrants, and so the thing that comes in on the heels of the 1893 Depression, it's hard to say this, is the white supremacy campaign of 1898, 1900. Different states, different times, but right around 1900, there's this explosion of anger coming out of the Depression. People get hurt. Evicted, houses, foreclosed, businesses shut down, and there's a tendency to blame, and blaming the awful black people is what they did. And so that's the part that I had no expectation that I would find something like that. And today, if you look at scholars who are looking at that time period, what I did in sorting out the New South City is something that a lot of folks are that's where it really ramped up to the distrust of the other becomes very intense in the early 20th century.
Yeah, and it sounds like that Charlotte wasn't immune from that. The most notable, I think, in North Carolina was down in Wilmington. Right?
Wilmington, they actually, the majority of people in Wilmington were African American. That's true in most coastal cities in the South. Black and white voted together to vote out the old government in Wilmington, put in a new government to help deal with this depression. And the old government rounded up everybody at gunpoint and said, we're taking back over. It's the only successful armed coup in the United States. And then they went out and killed as many black people. And things like that happened in Atlanta in 1906. Other cities in that period right around the turn of the last century.
But if we forward, say, to the 1960s, one of the things where Charlotte sometimes is seen as different than other cities in size, maybe in the South, is that you had leadership here that tried to kind of keep a lid on, tried to keep relations between the races, I don't know what the right word is here, but amicable, or at least not have some of the problems that you saw, say, in Alabama.
Right.
How did that play out in Charlotte, and what's the legacy of that?
It's fascinating, and it's a thing that I think makes me very proud of the city. In other parts of the South, you had, like in Birmingham, you had the police dogs and the fire hoses trying to shut down the civil rights movement. Here, Mayor Stan Brookshire, is there still somebody who lives here who's a Brookshire descendant? I think that was, again, I think that was true a little bit ago. But anyway, Stan Brookshire said that's bad for business. And Charlotte is a business progressive city, if there ever was one. And so when Birmingham was trying to shut down protesters, Stan Brookshire, 1963, said, called the Chamber of Commerce, said, all white men, said, you all know somebody in the black community. This week, we're going to invite you and them going to go out to dinner together. You're going to go out to lunch together. Go to the Manger Motel downtown. Remember that? They go to the Hotel Charlotte. And we'll call the restaurateurs in advance. They'll know it's happening everywhere. They can't push back about it. And Charlotte desegregated its upscale restaurants back in 1963, about 1 week. And hey, that's amazing. And that built on earlier things. Charles Jones at Johnson C. Smith University led one of the largest sit-ins when the lunch patter sit-ins were happening in Greensboro. 4 or 5 students would go sit in. Here, first day, 200 students coming down from the university up on the hill, Johnson C. Smith University. And eventually, this was the city where the court-ordered busing began with Swan versus Mecklenburg. And so the notion that to not disrupt the business and to be polite, so there's love being polite, that we were going to make this work,
And it strikes me that was a new thing. But also there's a legacy in that carries over to today, in that you have, even though you have so many newcomers here, people moving from all over the place, there's still, I think, sort of this idea that we'll sort of settle our differences in private, we'll talk things out behind closed doors, we won't air our dirty laundry as much. That can be positive, but that's not always positive. Do you still see vestiges of that?
Oh, I think so. In the Sorting at the New South City book, there was a thing about Charlotte in the late 50s. It wasn't particularly about issues of race. It was about issues of politics and corruption. They said, Charlotte doesn't have any corruption. We don't have a boss or anything like that. We have the Chamber of Commerce. And anything the Chamber of Commerce wants to do, that's what we did. And there was a ladder that you climbed. You joined the Chamber of Commerce, and then you became president of the Chamber of Commerce, and then you became mayor of Charlotte. And it really, settling issues behind closed doors, marshaling forces for change behind closed doors. The group with Ed Crutchfield and Hugh McCall and the bank leaders.
Dan Rookshire.
Yeah. Rupture is part of that, and so it always was a very good thing. In other ways, I've talked to people from other parts of the United States, but also people of color, people with union backgrounds. All of these kind of ways of making change, we are not so good at that, and it can be very frustrating.
I want to talk a little bit about your latest book, Affordable Housing in Charlotte, and some of this probably ties in with what we've been talking about, but affordable housing here gets a lot of attention, and you worry about people not being able to afford houses. Things get very expensive. I mean, certainly at the South End, you mentioned there's a lot going on down there, but those apartments are very expensive apartments. Tell us a little bit about your thinking about why you wanted to look into affordable housing for Charlotte and what you found.
As I've been here and been doing things and following Jane Jacobs and looking around me, I have a pretty good handle on how the city grew, what's where, who lives where, when things were done, and this leads to a large ego. And we got to the late 2010. And I ran into something that I didn't understand, which really frustrated me because I have this large ego about knowing the city. And it was the housing crisis. Charlotte is growing very quickly. And as it does, the building of housing is not keeping up. And neighborhoods like mine, I live in Plaza Midwood, where you used to be able to rent anything going down the street. Everything was rental, just about. Few owner-occupied houses. Now, the houses right around here are going for $1 million, $1.2 million. And that means a lot of people who we depend on are having a really hard time finding a place to live. And I'm talking about teachers. And I'm talking about the food service staff here. I don't know personally, but I would make you a bet there are folks that are having a really hard time. They serve you and enjoy that during the day, but then where is home? And nurse assistants, first responders. I gave a talk about the affordable housing book at one of the big churches down the street. And the minister said, Tom, most of our G are clergy. are finding it hard to find a place to live. And I didn't understand that. It seemed strange. Why don't they get a job? Well, talked to Dale Mullinex at the homeless shelter. He said, Tom, guess how many people at the homeless shelter, men at the homeless shelter last night are working? He said, over 50% full-time, and they still can't afford it. And so with all of that, COVID came along, and I started digging in and trying to understand the story of how that happened.
One of the ironies is that nationally, one of the reasons that people keep living here is because Charlotte is perceived as being affordable. And I guess it's sort of a question on compared to what? If you're coming from California or New York, things look pretty good here. But if you lived here your whole life.
I think that we are using our English in terms of in business recruitment is important. Affordable housing is important, not just for the executive level, but for everybody. Once we lose that, that's a thing that has been very much in the perception of being in our favor. I think we're losing it.
Okay, so what do we do about it?
There's no easy answer. And that's the first thing, the affordable housing book that's up there. I've had some copies for sale, by the way, if you want to take one home. But the things that are going on now in terms of building new affordable rental housing, that's mostly done through federal subsidies. Almost entirely through federal subsidies to developers, actually, so that they can make a profit if they include some affordable housing in their developments. And the amount of tax credit that the folks in Washington allow for that is tiny compared to the need. And so changing our federal tax policies would be a thing to consider. It's not because people don't work. It's not because developers are evil and not building affordable housing. You got to make the numbers work. And at the moment, in most American cities, there are housing shortages.
So what are the historical elements of this here? Are there historical elements that are at play? Or are there, is it legacy of redlining? Is there anything historically driving it?
All of those things are part of it. It used to be, and some of it is changing tastes. It used to be that folks, when they got married and started a household, they wanted a new house out in the suburbs. And most recently, folks who have the money and the choice say, well, I'd like to live in a more centrally located area where I could get to things a little bit better than I could if I was way out of the edge of town. And so that's part of what's changing. And for a long time, we assumed correctly, it seemed, that housing would just filter down. People build a house here, and then when they got further in their home journey, they would sell the starter home. Remember the term starter home? We don't have those anymore. And they would move out to a big ranch house out in the suburbs. I love the term ranch house. That indicates it's way out there, and you get your country squire station wagon, so out you go. And that's very much part of the mid-20th century mindset, but it's not working that way anymore. I wish I had a good bit of history that would solve the problem, but I don't.
Yeah, it's really a struggle. I think the median sales price of a house in Mecklenburg County is approaching $500,000. So, then
don't you wish you'd held on to your house?
So these, starter houses, the idea that you could buy something for $150,000, $200,000, $250,000, those don't, for the most part, exist in Mecklenburg County, and you're going to be paying a lot more and getting a lot less than you did historically. You see, I think people, there's a move toward townhouses now. These are housing that if you actually want to buy something, you're not going to get that ranch on a 3/4 of an acre lot. You're going to be sharing some walls with people.
The thing that everyone can participate in is there's a Charlotte Housing Trust Fund that's been around since about 2000. And what it does is use sales of bonds to create a pool of money that can help kind of make the numbers work. You got a developer who's ready to do this and that, but the numbers don't quite add up. The housing bond issue money, the Charlotte Housing Trust Fund, helps with that. Every 2 years, we go to the polls and we vote yay or nay. The last several years, every 2 years, we have voted like 70% for those bonds. And the hope is that this fall, there'll be a $200 million bond issue. Now, that sounds like a lot of money. But when you're starting to look at the number of developments here that would need some help, voting in favor of housing bonds is a good thing.
And what's the importance to the rest of Charlotte? If people themselves are not worried about housing, if they have their housing, if they're living somewhere and they're perfectly comfortable, what's at stake for making sure that everybody has somewhere that they can go?
That's the thing that was eye-opening for me, because I didn't know much about this stuff, and I had all sorts of stereotypes. And one is that, well, this low-income housing is for people who don't work. It's for Dale Mullen hit me on that one. But that it's their problem. It's not my problem. It's their problem. That's what I believed. And then I started to look at who qualifies for these housing subsidies for the subsidized units. They don't actually themselves get the subsidy. It's folks who are not making the median income, but about 60% of the median income or 30% of the median income. And it is librarians. Dang, I know librarians. They're not bad people, mostly. And they're preschool teachers. We need preschool teachers. And they're firefighter trainees. Boy, we need firefighter trainees. And nurse assistants. I'm not planning to get sick, but I know I will. And in fact, I did. This was one of the things that was really eye-opening. About 5 years ago, and this is before COVID, so it must have been a little bit more than that, I got perforated diverticulitis. Don't look that up. You do not want to know what that is. It's awful. I came close to dying. I was in both Novant and Atrium for about a week. And what I do when I'm around people, because I'm a shy person, and unless somebody is asking me great questions, thank you, is I'll say, so where are you from? And so I say, where are you from with everybody who came to help me? Nurses, people that cleaned the room, I love the people who cleaned the room. I was highly susceptible to infection, and people who cleaned the room were my best friends. My doctors, my allergy people, the infectious disease guy, not one of them lived in Charlotte. They couldn't afford to. They were coming in from Pageland and Bessemer City and Albemarle. And in a hospital, you work a 10-hour shift or a 12-hour shift and an hour and a half commute on top of that. Doesn't make me feel safe. And so that, to me, that's what's at stake, is that either we have a society in which we can all live together in some way, shape, or form, or we're in a society where it's kind of dangerous to be alive.
Okay. On that note, do you have any hopeful words? Is there anything that gives me hope and makes you think, okay, there's something that can be done about this, or there's something that's resolved?
The amount of affordable housing that's been built in this area is impressive. It's not nearly enough, but what's been built is really good. If y'all been across the street to Ashley Park Lane, do you know the little, I think it's behind Whole Foods grocery store, or some boutique restaurants and things like that, apartments up above. Did you know that that's affordable housing? It's mixed income housing. It's developed partly by Inlivia and the Housing Authority, and partly by Peter Pappas, who I'm sure somebody in here knows, because that family has been so involved in real estate. They're the same people who did Phillips Place. But when they did the Ashley Park Lane area, they included low-income apartments that are sprinkled in. You can't tell whether your neighbor is in a low-income apartment or not. And if you go around the back and drive around the curly cues of streets there, there's a senior housing development. Wow. There's about 80 units of low-income housing right across the street here. And most of us did not know that it was there. We've been kind of coached to believe that if people at a different income level move into our neighborhood, it'll hurt our property values. And South Park is still pretty good on property values, right? It is something. And so the fact that we know how to do it gives me hope. And the fact that folks are voting for the housing bonds gives me hope.
Okay, that's it for today. To our listeners, thanks for listening. This episode of the Charlotte Ledger podcast was produced by Lindsay Banks. This episode of the Charlotte Ledger podcast was presented by Crimson Park Digital. Get your brand seen, capture demand, and turn attention into revenue now. Visit crimsonparkdigital.com to get started.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.